Today we're going to get into lesson 3.1 over parallel lines and transversals. Chapter 1 we talked about equations, Chapter 2 we talked about different types of transformations, and now we're getting into another geometry standard which covers parallel lines and transversals. So first we'll talk about the key vocabulary. So again, I take a second, pause this video, write this down. The first word, or first term I should say, is parallel lines. Okay, you should have heard of parallel lines before. They are lines that do not intersect. Okay, so remember, lines go on forever. Okay, so those are the ones that have arrows on the end. So parallel lines are ones that even whenever they extend forever, they will never intersect one another. Okay, so kind of like these are parallel lines that if they're extended forever, they will never cross one another. Transversal is a line that intersects two or more lines. So that's what we're going to deal with in this section. We're talking about transversals, and we'll talk about their angles, which we'll discuss in a bit. But a transversal is a line that intersects two or more lines. So a transversal would look like this. Okay? Actually, let me draw that in another color. So parallel lines. So parallel, and then you have a transversal, which is a line that intersects two or more lines. So that is your transversal. Okay, so parallel lines are the lines that never intersect, and a transversal is a line that intersects two or more lines, like this. And then finally we have supplementary angles, which again should be something you cover in 7th grade, but those are angles that add up to 180 degrees. That's a very important idea in this chapter, or in this section I should say, because it will be used to find angle measures of parallel lines when a transversal is cut through it. And we'll look at more examples with supplementary angles in a second. Here's another thing about the parallel lines and transversals, something that needs to be known. It says when parallel lines are cut by a transversal, so this is where they're cut by a transversal, 8 pairs of angles are formed with many of them congruent to one another. And we'll talk about which ones are congruent to which. But here is your 8 angles. So you're going to have 4 on the top parallel line and 4 on the bottom parallel line. So it'll be like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I messed that up for a second. 5, 6 on the top, 7, 8. So those are your 8 pairs, or 8 angles that are formed. And like I said, there's a lot of them that are congruent to one another, and we'll talk about which of those are congruent. Corresponding angles is a first one to look at as far as being congruent. So this says corresponding angles from one parallel line to another are congruent. So let me show you what that means. So if I'm looking at this picture, the best way to visualize this is first I want to identify my parallel lines. So this is parallel line 1 and this is parallel line 2. These are the 2 lines that when they go on forever they'll never touch, but the transversal is the one that goes through those parallel lines. Okay, so those parallel lines go through, or the transversal goes through those parallel lines, creating 8 angles. So the best way to understand which ones are corresponding is first I'm going to look at each parallel line and make a box around those 4. Okay, this isn't like something you have to do. This is just the easiest way that I have found for students to be able to recognize their parallel lines, or their corresponding angles, I should say. So there's the top one, and then we have our bottom 4 as well. So these boxes of 4, then from there you're just looking at which angles, like we've talked about before with corresponding. We talked about corresponding angles with shapes, so now we're talking about with parallel lines and transversals. You're looking for which, corresponding means which angles are in the same position on both sets, or both boxes in this case. So we have this box and this box. For example, 1 is in the upper left of these four angles. So on this one, the upper left is 5. So that means 5 is corresponding with 1. And that means that they're congruent because it says corresponding angles from one parallel line to another are congruent. So the way I would write that is, let me erase this real quick. Angle 1 is congruent. Remember, your congruent symbol is equal with a squiggly line on top. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 5. And what that means is they have the same angle measurement. So for example, if 1 was 110 degrees, 5 would also be 110 degrees. And then you can just go around, kind of like we did in chapter 2, and just point out which angles are congruent or are corresponding with the angles below. So angle 2 is in the upper right, angle 6 is in the upper right. So that means angle 2 is congruent to angle 6. Then we have angle 3 in the bottom left, angle 7 in the bottom left. So angle 3 is congruent to angle 7. And finally, angle 8 and angle 4 are also in these same positions. So those are also congruent angles or corresponding angles. So then we have those 4 pairs of corresponding angles. So that's something you will also need to know and be able to do, because representing or pointing out and picking out those is pretty much the basis of this section. We'll have to identify congruent angles or find missing angles. So another way to do that is through supplementary angles. Okay, so this is another thing that you will need to know. It says supplementary angles are angles of a straight line that add up to 180 degrees. So there is a lot of straight lines in this picture. And this can throw students off sometimes because they see this transversal coming through and they ignore the straight lines because there's things going through one another. But for example, what I mean by that is, this parallel line is a straight line. Okay? When the transversal cuts through it, 2 angles are formed. But that doesn't take away the fact that this is still a straight line. So 1 and 2, that means these 2 right here, there's still that straight line there. These are called supplementary angles because, as it says, they're angles of a straight line that add up to 180 degrees. Okay, so what I mean by that is 1 and 2, those are both forming this straight line. Okay, so whenever these are added together, we know their angles will be 180 degrees. And there's all kinds of different supplementary angles in this section, or in this example. I will say one tip is that you can only have supplementary angles on like each group of 4. Okay, so you have all kinds in this top group of 4, and then you have them in the bottom. They cannot come together though. Okay, that's a different type that you'll see later in geometry. But as of now, all we're dealing with is these top 4 and these bottom 4 as a group. So another straight line is the transversal itself. Okay, the transversal itself, as you see, that means that those are supplementary angles. Okay, and since these are supplementary angles, they also add to 180. And if you use a little intuition or use a little deep thinking, if 1 and 2 add to 180 and then 1 and 3 add to 180, what does that mean 3 and 2 are? And if you think about it, those are actually going to be the same angle measure because they have in common 1 when they both add to 180. So another way you can know that is through vertical angles, which if they're straight across from each other like 3 and 2 are, they will have the same angle measurement. And I know this is getting away from supplementary, but it's also something you can use to help you. 2 and 3 are vertical, meaning they're the same. 1 and 4 are also vertical, so those are the same. So you can use your supplementary angles to find that they add to 180. Vertical angles are the same. Corresponding angles are the same. So all kinds of different tips on how to find missing angle measurements. So let's use those ideas to look at some examples. So this says, use the figure to find the measure of angle 1 and angle 2. Okay, so first of all, we have this angle that's given to us is 110 degrees. And they want us to find these two angles. First thing I'm going to do is find my parallel lines, okay, because that'll help me identify things. So if you look, these two are my parallel lines. So we have parallel line A and parallel line B. So again, once you recognize your parallel lines, something that is helpful would be to make your box around each of the four parallel lines. So we have, or each of the four angles that are involved in each parallel line. So we have those four, and then we have these four. So, again, the first thing I'm going to do, if I were doing this problem, would be 110, I'm looking for its corresponding angle. So remember, corresponding means in the same position in the other set of box, or the other box, I should say. So 110 is in the bottom left of these four angles, okay? So then I look over here and say, what's in the bottom left of these four angles? And if you look, 1 is in that bottom left. So therefore, remember, like we said, corresponding angles are congruent. So since this angle that's given is 110, and it's in the same position or corresponding with angle 1 is also 110 degrees. So that's how we find our first angle measurement. Okay, so angle 1 equals 110 degrees. So that's our first one. And then we have to, again, some of these aren't straightforward. You have to actually use a little deep thinking to figure out which way you can find those other angle measurements. So for example, 1 and 2, what are those angles? Like, how are they connected to one another? How are they related? And if you think about it, this right here, B, is a straight line. This is straight line B. So B, since that's a straight line, and these fall together like this straight line is 180 degrees. And that makes 1 and 2 supplementary angles. So remember, supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees. So I'm going to create an equation using this idea. So, equals 180 degrees. And we know that, let me erase this for a second, I'll write it back up there in a second. We know that angle 1 plus angle 2 equals 180 degrees by definition of supplementary angles. But we already found that angle 1 is 110 degrees. So I'm going to take angle 1 and replace it with 110 degrees. You can treat this whole thing as a variable, and if you want to replace it with a variable, you can. That's fine. But now we're just solving for angle 2 using what we learned in chapter 1. We have to get angle 2 by itself. So we have to move 110 degrees. In order to move a positive 110, you subtract 110 from both sides. The positive 110 and negative 110 cancel, leaving me with angle 2, which is what I want. And then 180 minus 110 is 70. So that tells me that angle 2 is 70 degrees. So my final answer is angle 1 equals 110 degrees. Angle 2 equals 70 degrees. And that's just using the rules that we had just went over. So let's look at another example of this. So this is on your own. I would pause the video, try this one on your own. Once you're finished, go ahead and start it back up, and we'll look at how we break this down. So it says, use the figure to find the measure of angle 1 and 2. So again, first thing I would do is recognize or point out my parallel lines. I have parallel line X, parallel line Y. Those never cross. So these are my parallel lines. And I'm going to make boxes around their four angles. So we have these four and these four. Again, usually your first thing you'll do is recognize corresponding angles. meaning they're in the same position. So we have this box is 63 is given to us, and it's in that upper right. So if it's on the right or in the upper right, we have to find the angle that's in the upper right over here in this box. And if you look, that is angle 2. So right away, we know corresponding angles are congruent, so angle 2 equals 63 degrees. So we still need to find angle 1. But you should be able to recognize 1 and 2. Together they form this straight line y. This straight line is formed by 1 and 2. So since that is formed by those, that makes those supplementary angles. And we know that those supplementary angles add to be 180. So then I'm going to create my equation again. Angle 1 plus angle 2 equals 180. And now I'm going to replace angle 2 with 63 degrees because we found that angle 2 is 63. Now we're just going to solve for angle 1, treating this as a variable. So to do that, we do the opposite of plus 63 and we subtract 63 from both sides. Cancel, cancel. Angle 1 equals 180 minus 63 is 117 degrees. So that means our missing angle 1 is 117 degrees. So you use those rules of corresponding angles, supplementary angles, to find your missing angles. And that's just the steps you can go through. They also might ask you for all 7 missing angles. They might only give you 1 angle, and they might ask for all 7 that are missing, which can still be done using those rules we've talked about. So let's look at an example like that. So again, they give us the figure. They say find the missing angle measures. So we have to find angle 1 through 7. So I'm going to go ahead and write these up here so then we can fill them in as we go, as we talk about how to solve them, or find them, I should say. So they give us the one angle, which is 75 degrees. And then they give us, again, we can go through that same process. Identifying our parallel lines would be the first thing. So parallel lines are A and B. So I'm going to make the box around parallel line A, its angles, and parallel line B, I'll make the box around its angles. Once I've made the boxes, here's the thing with finding all of the angles. There's many ways you can go about it. Okay? You can start with corresponding, you can start with supplementary, you can start with vertical, you can start anywhere, but you just have to go whatever way you start, you'll eventually be able to find all 7. The biggest thing to understand is they give us one angle. Okay? Probably be best if you just start the way you always do, with corresponding angles. Here's a hint I'll give you. There's only going to be 2 different angle measurements for all of these. Okay? So if you get anything other than just 2 different numbers, you mess something up, because there's only going to be 2 different numbers that are used for all 8 angle measurements. So 75 is in the upper right. So in the upper right over here is angle 6. So right away we know corresponding angles are congruent. So angle 6 is 75 degrees. Okay, and you can mark these out as you go if you want, just so you can keep track of everything. So angle 6 is found. Again, you can do a lot of different ways. You can actually find all 4 over here if you want, and then just do corresponding this way. Okay, so let's say we do that from here. 1 and 2 are what type of angles? If you think, they're on this straight line T, so that means 2 and 75 are supplementary because they create that straight line together. So I'll use my equation, 75 plus angle 2 equals 180. And we just solve for angle 2 by subtracting 75 from both sides. Cancels, cancels. Angle 2 equals 105. So that means angle 2 is 105 degrees. So let me erase that real quick. So I'll mark out angle 2. You can continue to do supplementary angles because technically angle 2 and angle 1, they also are on a straight line. Okay, so you can use supplementary angles there. Or you can use the vertical angles that I mentioned before, where 75 and 1 are straight across from each other. Okay, so since they're straight across, that means they are the same. So angle 1 is also 75 degrees. So we did that. And then if you notice that angle 2 and angle 3 are also straight across. Okay, so since they are straight across from another, and we already found angle 2 is 105, that means angle 3 is also 105 degrees. So now once we found all of them on this left box, we can just use corresponding angles to find the ones on the right side. So angle 2 is in the upper left. Angle 5 is also in the upper left. We found angle 2 is 105. So remember, corresponding angles are congruent, meaning they're the same. So that means since angle 2 is 105, angle 5 would also be 105 degrees. And you just keep going. Angle 1 corresponds with angle 4. So angle 1 was 75 degrees. Angle 4 is also 75 degrees. And then finally, angle 3 is in the bottom right. Angle 7 is in the bottom right, so they're corresponding. And angle 3 is 105, so therefore angle 7 is 105. So, like I said, there's only 2 different angle measurements for all of them. It's 75 degrees and 105 degrees. And I'll also give you a hint that you should only have, for all 8, you should have 4 of one of them and 4 of the others. Meaning, in this example, 4 should be 75 and 4 should be 105. So if you count, we have the original 75 given to us, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 75 degrees, and 1, 2, 3, 4 105 degrees. So that shows you that those are corresponding, or those are the correct angle measurements going through those various steps. Again, you can start that any way. You can start with corresponding, you can start with supplementary, you can start with vertical. Either way, you just have to follow those steps as you go through to find all 7. So again, this isn't on your own. I would pause it, try and find it. Find all 7 missing. So as you heard the bell, I am running out of time. So hopefully you paused it and tried it on your own. I'm going to go ahead and just tell you each of them. Again, I'll do a quick overview. You can start with your boxes. You can start with corresponding if you prefer. You can start with the vertical being the same. You can start with supplementary, adding to 180. But as you go through these, you should have got angle 1 is 59 degrees. Angle 2 is 121 degrees. Angle 3 is 121 degrees. Angle 4 is 59 degrees. Angle 5 is 121 degrees. Angle 6 is 59 degrees. And angle 7 is 121 degrees. So those are your 7 missing angles to finish that problem off. Okay, so hopefully that helped. Hopefully you understood the lesson today. And if you have questions, feel free to ask me. But this is chapter 3, section 1, parallel lines and transversals.